Hi, Jonathan York from Bay Financial Partners, looking at investment markets. Latest data coming out of the US, certainly on the employment side, was on the weak side. Payrolls for July actually fell 23,000 versus expected of a positive 80,000. And the 2-month revision was down by over 100,000. That gave us sort of a 3-month average of only just plus 20,000 for the US economy, which really is pretty benign growth on the jobs front. And that's despite Trump and his administration coming out and saying, about the economy is really one of the hottest out there, and it's really growing, and certainly on the employment side, it is doing very well. Now, clearly, the data doesn't support those claims. Then on the inflation front, it was a little bit on the weaker side. That was probably due to the fact that data incorporated the potential sort of ceasefire on the Iranian-US conflict, which did see oil fall dramatically. So core CPI was running about 2.5%. Now that's obviously still above the 2% target from the Fed. And it's certainly interesting to see how that sort of plays out in the next sort of couple of months, because certainly with what appears to be a sort of an impasse between the US and Iran, the Straits of Hormuz, and getting oil sort of shipped through there, oil prices have started to rise again. And indeed, in one bizarre claim at the weekend, Trump came out and said actually soon he expects to be able to say that the Straits of Hormuz is now a US territory, which really is pretty bizarre on all levels. And certainly Trump's approval ratings appear to be falling all the time, despite what he comes out and says. As it appears the US population is getting increasingly frustrated with the war in Iran. Now, so far the earnings season has been pretty good. About 65% of companies that have reported have beaten their estimates. But this week we get a lot of the retail earnings coming through, and it'll just be interesting to see the strength of the US consumer. A little bit of mixed news on rates after that US data, but rates are still holding pretty firm. 30-year is 526. The all-important 10-year is nearly at 470 at 469, and the 2-year is 424. But what is also interesting as well is that inflation-linked bond, that 10-year, is currently running at 236. So that gives a pretty clear indication that inflation is still pretty inherent in the US economy. Now, as stated, oil has started to come back with the sort of impasse between the US and Iran. WTI is currently 82.40 and change, and the Brent is nudging up towards $90 at 88.50. Now, what has been quite surprising in the UK is that the UK economy is actually doing pretty well, despite the rising oil prices. And it's just hope that, certainly they can get some sort of solution to the US-Iranian situation, and then the UK economy can continue to sort of grow. Indeed, the weather in the UK has also seen a few wildfires coming through as well, which is pretty much unheard of in the UK. And certainly the water situation is getting not quite desperate, but it's getting to very low levels. Now, the EU is still fighting those wildfires, and they're really, taking a pretty strong hold in Italy, Spain, and France. And that's starting to have a little bit of an impact on the tourism trade going through during the summer months. Now, in Australia, the Reserve Bank left rates on hold as expected. The cash rate remains at 4.35. But it was considered to be a hawkish hold. But if inflation does return and starts to increase, then potentially they could look to increase interest rates, which is pretty much what you expect from a central bank. Now, here in New Zealand, again, the surveys sort of coming through both on the business side and also the consumer side are showing a little bit of optimism out there, and showing some improving results. Which appears to imply that the economy potentially is sort of on the upward track. Now, obviously, that's all sort of dependent on oil prices, which, as I said previously, have started to increase a little bit. But certainly they're well off their highs. And also some pretty encouraging news from Mainfreight as well, which are pretty much a bellwether stock for the New Zealand economy, and that shows some pretty improved earnings and guidance going forward. So potentially there is, a little bit of optimism out there in the New Zealand economy, and hopefully that can continue into year end. So if you are looking for income options, go to the website www.bayfinancialpartners.co.nz for lots of interesting articles. We look forward to speaking to you soon.